All right, hello everyone. I wanted to go ahead and do this video just for the sake of time because, as you know, Monday is a holiday, so it's Labor Day, so we're not going to be able to get together and we're not going to be able to come back together until next Wednesday during week 4. So I don't want us to get too far behind. We need to go ahead and start chapter 2 and start kind of learning the ways that we measure crime and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and do this video. And this video will be the first part of the lecture that you will watch starting Monday if you want to watch it Monday, but it needs to be watched by Wednesday when we come face to face because we're going to continue the conversation then. So this first part of the video is going to cover kind of how we measure crime in the United States and go through some of the major data sources. So I would encourage you to take notes. I know that you are a face-to-face class, so you're not really used to me doing lectures online. So I would encourage you to listen and take notes. You will have a copy of the PowerPoint that you can kind of follow along with, and we'll go from there, okay? So we're going to start out with a question. Why is crime measured? Why do we measure crime? Well, there are 4 major reasons why we measure crime. The first one is that measuring crime allows us to understand the extent and the nature of the criminal behavior itself. So it allows us to kind of understand how prevalent that type of crime is in society, and it helps us understand the incidents better. So characteristics of offenders and victims, characteristics of neighborhoods where crime occur, and things like that. The next reason is it allows us to evaluate the benefits of policies and laws that we have in place. So are laws effective? Remember back to our last lecture, we talked about kind of how crime is defined and that type of thing. We know that it is defined by statute and law, and so we need to make sure that the laws that are put into place are truly effective in doing their job. And then it also allows us to identify groups that are suffering disproportionate amounts of victimization. So it allows us to kind of understand more about the victims of crime. And then finally, it allows us to kind of target assistance that victims may need. And so all 4 of these reasons are valid reasons why we need to measure crime. So there are many mechanisms that we have in the criminal justice world that allows us to measure crime, and different mechanisms that allows us to pull data when studying crime. And so the first type of mechanisms utilized are from law enforcement records. Uh, Law enforcement typically will turn in data to the federal government on a yearly basis around the types of crimes, around incidents, things like that. So those tools are very specific in what data we can pull from. So under law enforcement records, the first type or the first tool that we have is called the Uniform Crime Report. And this is a program that the FBI spearheads, and it compiles national crime data. So the UCR is the oldest national crime data collection effort in the United States. In 1927, the International Association of Chiefs of Police established a committee on the uniform crime records to develop a program as well as procedures for uniformly collecting information about crime. So the International Chiefs of Police basically saw the need to study crime and kind of find some trends that were happening throughout the United States, but they wanted it in a uniform way. They didn't want Statesboro PD reporting certain things and then Chatsworth Police Department reporting different. They wanted some uniformity into what data is being collected. And so they developed the Uniform Crime Report. And the Uniform Crime Report is probably one of the foundational tenets in our data collection. And I've used the UCR several times in research. It's very beneficial, and we'll talk about the specific data points that you can pull from the UCR. And we'll talk about the UCR in depth here in a little bit. So the next one is the supplementary homicide report. Now the SHR is a branch of the Uniform Crime Report, or the UCR, and it really kind of gives extra details around the homicides that are occurring and the data around that. So the SHR gives us victim ages, sex, race, offender age, sex, race, weapons, if weapons were utilized, what type of weapons were utilized, victim-offender relationships, and circumstances that led to the homicide. Next, we have the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or the NIBRS. Now, this is a complex national data collection system that gathers incident-based crime information from law enforcement. So the NIBRS is specifics. And so the Uniform Crime Report, basically, it's broken down into part 1, part 2 crimes, and police just report if those crimes are occurring. And then you have the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or what I'll refer to as the NIBRS, that gives you more specific information, more detailed information on specific incidents. The NIBRS details information about crime, including the nature and types of crimes committed during each incident. It gives victim offender characteristics, the type and value of stolen or recovered property, characteristics of arrested individuals. Information reported is completely voluntary. And you typically see in these reporting methodologies, I guess is the word you can say, is something known as the hierarchy rule. So this rule basically states that the UCR only the most serious crimes committed during a criminal event is reported to the FBI. NIBRS allows for all incidents to be included. So the hierarchy rule basically says that only the most serious crime committed during a criminal offense. So if you had a robbery and someone was murdered during that robbery, the murder would be reported in the UCR, not the robbery, because the murder is the more serious offense. However, in the National Incident-Based Reporting System, it allows for both the murder and the robbery to be reported together, and we can extrapolate different characteristics and variables from both of those crimes together. So the NIBRS has different classes of crime, or different classes of offenses. That it takes an incident and kind of classifies the offense in the following ways. So you have Group A offenses, which are more serious and frequently occurring offenses. These are most likely to come to the attention of law enforcement. There's 24 categories, and there's 52 offenses in those categories. So these are like animal cruelty, arson, bribery, abduction, things like that. Group B offenses, so you have in the NIBRS, you have Group A, Group B. So your Group A offenses are your more serious and more frequently occurring offenses. Your Group B offenses only collect arrest data and consist of 10 offenses. And that includes like disorderly conduct, gambling, trespassing, and curfew violations. All right, and then your last mechanism that we utilize to gather information around crime occurring is through the use of surveys. And we ask citizens directly about their experience with the crime. And if they're victims, they typically get a survey to kind of talk, that kind of gives more detail about the incidents and things like that. So that is known as the National Crime Victims Survey, or the NCVS. And the NCVS is a nationally representative survey of victims. And we're going to kind of go into the NCVS because it has different survey tools that they use to compile the full survey itself. So we're going to go into each of these a little bit more in detail, okay? So those tools that we just talked about are measured by different federal agencies. So the FBI, or the Federal Bureau of Investigations, utilizes the UCR, the Supplemental Homicide Report, or the SHR, and the NIBRS. Those measuring mechanisms are under the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Then the National Crime Victims Survey is utilized by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or the BJS. And their focus is really kind of victimization and looking at victim data. And so the main thing out of this slide is know that not all of these tools are utilized by the FBI. The NCVS is actually utilized by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. All right, so let's talk about the UCR. And remember when I said that the Uniform Crime Report is it is the oldest mechanism or tool that we utilize for data collection. But it relies on agencies, police agencies, to report crimes to them. It falls under the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so yearly police agencies will report their data, their local data, to the federal government, FBI, through the Uniform Crime Report. And so the UCR collects from about 17,000 agencies, and it classifies its data into Part 1 crimes and Part 2 crimes. So your Part 1 crimes are your more serious crimes. So that's like where your homicide and your rape would occur. Part 2 crimes are your less common and less serious occurrences, or less serious violations. That's like your gambling and things like that. The supplemental homicide report out of the UCR, that's specific to homicides, and it's a more detailed data source for homicides specifically. And then you have what is known as the summary reporting system. And the summary reporting system is a part of the UCR, and it is only aggregated crime data. So it kind of brings all of the information together, and it's kind of a raw aggregated data source. And some benefits to utilizing the UCR is it allows for analysis at the different levels, so different cities. It provides a stable methodology. So when we're looking at research, we know that research methodology is important because that kind of keeps some validity concerns about the data that we're collecting in check. And so you see that it's very stable methodologically when you're utilizing the UCR. And it gathers information from broad areas of agencies. So you have all types of agencies that are reporting crime to the FBI under the UCR. However, the UCR does have some limitations. So one limitation is that it's solely reliant on law enforcement reports. So you have what's known as the dark figures of crime that kind of creep up. And what this is that not every crime is reported to law enforcement. And so it's not all encompassing of crime. It gives us a very specific look at what has been reported of those crimes that have been reported. But official crime data out of the UCR is only reported crimes. It does not capture those unreported criminal offenses. So like it doesn't, if someone was raped and never reports that, that's never going to be captured on the UCR. There have been mechanisms put into place like with the NCVS, the NCVS, that kind of helps capture some of that, those dark figures, but the UCR is very reliant. Actually, it's solely reliant on law enforcement reporting their data to the feds. And sometimes law enforcement doesn't report their data. And so then you will have chunks of data missing that never really is captured in any type of analysis. Another limitation is only official crime data better reflected law enforcement activity than it did actual changes in crime. So because law enforcement is the one reporting their data to the feds, it's really only, like the data that we see there is only showing us law enforcement's activity. It's not really showing us like the changes in crime and things like that. At the time, available data failed to provide information on the characteristics of offenders, on victims, on the incident. It's very much like, here's the amount of homicides we had, here's the amount of property crimes we had, here's the amount of white-collar crimes we had. It doesn't really give us much detail about those, the characteristics of those crimes. So here is the table from your book. And this lays out all Part 1 crimes and Part 2 crimes from the UCR. This is a fantastic tool whenever trying to understand about the UCR. So you see those Part 1 crimes, remember, are your more serious crimes. So that's where you see your murder, your rape, your robberies, arson, human trafficking, all of those serious crimes come in to play. Your Part 2 crimes are your less serious crimes. So you're going to see like drug abuse violations, disorderly conduct, drunkenness. All of those are your Part 2 crimes, the less serious crimes. All right, so now we're going to look at the NIBRS. And the National Incident-Based Reporting System, remember whenever I said one of the limitations for the UCR is that it doesn't give us characteristics of the crime. It just tells us that the crime occurred. Well, the NIBRS gives us characteristics of crime. So it is very focused on the incident details. So remember, it classifies into two categories as well, Group A and Group B. Group A are 22 crimes covering 46 offenses, including homicide and robbery. And Group B are 11 offenses that are lesser severe offenses, such as like loitering. The National Incident-Based Reporting System covers more crime than the SRS. And it distinguishes between attempted crime and completed crime. So that is a very important distinction that we find with the NIBRS. And one of the limitations for the NIBRS is it's voluntary. So law enforcement isn't required to kind of hand over their incident detail informations. That's totally a voluntary basis. So whereas there are some reporting standards with the UCR, there are not reporting standards with the NIBRS. Another issue or limitation with the NIBRS is that it only reflects known crimes. So remember, the NIBRS is also utilized by the FBI. So law enforcement can report their incidents to the FBI under the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And they only report incident-specific information to known crimes. So yet again, like you see with the UCR, the NIBRS is only as good as what's put in it. And so inherently it's flawed because law enforcement is relying only on the crimes that they know are occurring. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Bureau of Justice Statistics measurement of crime. And if you remember back to 2 slides ago, we know that that's going to be the National Crime Victim Survey. But the National Crime Victim Survey wasn't always called the National Crime Victim Survey. So President Lyndon Johnson concluded that the UCR provided inadequate data to inform policy recommendations. And he found that there were those 4 major issues with the UCR that we talked about. So he found that they needed an alternative. So he brought together what was known as the National Crime Panel. And the National Crime Panel actually changed its name to the National Crime Victimization Survey in 1991. But the National Crime Panel started in 1972, and it originally consisted of 2 household samples and 2 commercial samples. And they looked at specific incidents from the viewpoint of the victims. So Lyndon Johnson figured, hey, you have these limitations with the UCR. It's not giving us all of the information we need to adequately address the problems with crime through policy. We really need to hear more from the victims, because remember, one of the major limitations to the UCR is that it's only as good as what's reported to the police. So in an effort to capture these dark figures of crime, the National Crime Panel was put together. And the NCVS, the National Crime Victims Survey, today is the primary source of information about frequency, characteristics, and consequences of violent victimizations against persons ages 12 and older, and property victimizations against U.S. households. So the NCVS is really our primary tool used to measure frequency, characteristics, and overall consequences of those crimes. You can read more about the NCVS in your text. However, I will say that crimes are classified into 2 categories: those that are against person and those that are against households. So you see us, like most of these tools, kind of subcategorize crime, and it's typically 2 different categories. So with the UCR, you have part 1, part 2 crimes. With the National Incident-Based Reporting System, you have Group A, Group B crimes. And the Bureau of Justice Statistics, as NCVS, is no different. You have crimes against person and crimes against household. The NCVS is, sorry, I'm just trying to look at some of my notes. The NCVS is a nationally representative survey of victims of property and personal violence in the United States. It's the primary source of information, like I said, around frequency, characteristic, and consequences, and it's administered by utilizing 2 separate tools. So we're going to talk about those tools here. The NCVS-1 is a screening instrument. So it determines whether respondents was a victim of like a threatened, attempted, or completed crime within the past 6 months. And then if they determine that yes, they were a crime victim, then they give them what is known as the NCVS-2. And the NCVS-2 is the instrument that's focused on gathering the detailed information of those crimes from the victim's standpoint. So the victim then fills out characteristics about the crime. So like, what was the outcome of the crime? When and where did the crime occur? What were the demographics? How many victims were around? Were there any bystanders? How many offenders were there? So it breaks it down really into a lot more detail. But the NCVS is not perfect. And in 2007 and 2008, the NCVS was reviewed for improvement. The effectiveness of the NCVS had been undermined by sample cuts so large that only a year-to-year change of 8% was considered statistically significant. Paper and pencil surveys were outdated and made changes and updating difficult. So it's unclear how the redesign will occur or when it will occur, but there are calls to kind of modernize the NCVS. So what are some benefits to the NCVS? Well, it helps us identify trends in victimization. It helps us gather a lot of information around those dark figures of crime, those unreported criminal offenses, because believe it or not, um, it's been shown that the NCVS is bringing to light more of those criminal offenses that we never knew about. It provides a broad coverage of details on victims, offenders, and incidents, and it has a very high response rate, which means that people are actually filling it out and actually doing it. And if you've taken a research class, or when you take a research class, you're going to learn about quantitative and qualitative methodologies. And one of the drawbacks to some of those methodologies is what's considered a response rate. And typically when we look at surveys as the tool or instrument that we utilize to gather the information, response rates are typically low, because that's like, if you get a piece of mail that's a survey, how likely are you to do it? Well, for the NCVS, we have an extremely high response rate. People are more than willing to share their experience about being crime victims. However, there are some limitations. As great of information as the NCVS gathers, we do have some limitations to it. So its design is inherently flawed. It's designed to only show national level data. So it doesn't really show trends in local level. It's designed specifically to show national level data. Then you have the limitation around age. Remember, it's only targeting victims ages 12 and older. So those child victims that are under 12, that's never captured. And remember, some of those victimizations are never reported to law enforcement. So that is never reported in the UCR or any of the other FBI tools. Another limitation is that the NCVS has a limited population coverage. It does not include the homeless, prisoners, military personnel, or anyone who changes residences frequently. Why is that? Well, it's a survey that is sent to a victim's address. So if that victim is not at that address, that victim's never going to be able to fill out the NCVS. And then it only covers so much crime. So the NCVS is heavily weighted towards street crimes. So remember, those street crimes, when we talked about the types of crime, the street crimes are what you think of as crime, that have an offender and a victim. The NCVS doesn't really tell us about victimless crimes or white-collar crimes. It does have some sampling errors. So it's heavily reliant on people's memory. And I don't know about you, but my memory isn't that great. Like I said in class, I've been hit over the head with chairs. So you see errors occurring when people try to reconcile what's happened to them. And so especially with victims who are placed in such a traumatic situation as being victimized, their memory might be a little skewed. They might not be able to recall certain details that really the NCVS is looking to gather. And one of the major limitations is the idea of series victimizations. The NCVS doesn't really capture series victimizations very well. So you might be asking, Mr. Dean, what are you talking about series victimizations? Well, those are victimizations that are not discrete in nature, but ongoing with no defined start or stopping point. So the NCVS is looking at incidents of victimization. There are several types of victims that suffer ongoing victimization or multiple victimizations that aren't isolated to just an incident. So there are some who have no defined starting or stopping point. And this can present a conundrum in the terms of how do we count those series victimization victims. Some common examples of series victimization is like your intimate partner violence or your domestic violence, sex trafficking, bullying, things like that. All right, this is gonna be the end of part one, because in class on Wednesday, we're actually gonna start talking about some of the trends that are found with the types of crimes through these instruments. But I wanted to leave you with this. This is from your text. This is an example of the NCVS too. So remember, the NCVS has two instruments that it uses to make up the whole NCVS. The first one is like your screening tool, and if they determine that the person has been victimized within the past 6 months, then they give them this instrument, which is the NCVS2. And that is utilized to capture all of the details of the incident. So I hope you guys have enjoyed. I am going to timestamp this so that you can go back through, and if I rush through something or you miss something, you can listen to the part that you need. I will see everyone Wednesday, and we will go into some of the trends that these tools give us. So I hope everyone has a great week, a great holiday on Monday. As always, feel free to reach out to me if you need anything.